Hey guys, tonight we descend into the mud-soaked, fog-drenched world of medieval Europe, a civilization known for castles' chivalry and dramatic paintings of men pointing at things, but beneath the stained glass windows and romantic legends of knights and kingdoms lies a much harder truth, because while medieval Europe gave us Gothic cathedrals, universities, and the foundations of modern law, it also gave its average citizen a daily existence so brutal, so filthy, and so terrifyingly fragile that you'd be begging to go home before the morning bells even rang. So before you romanticize the doublet and the drawbridge, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome to medieval Europe, where your day begins not with a gentle alarm, but with church bells slamming through the darkness like God himself is annoyed at you. Your home is a one-room structure made of timber wattle and daub, which is a fancy way of saying sticks mud and desperation. The walls are thin, the roof is thatched, which means it is essentially a pile of dried grass above your head. And if you've ever wondered what dried grass does, when it gets warm, the answer is burn. The floor is packed dirt, sometimes covered with rushes, which are long-dried reeds that also serve as your carpet, your trash bin, and occasionally your toilet area for the animals, because yes, the animals live with you in winter. The pig sleeps 3 feet from your head, not as a pet, but as a heat source. You don't question this. You are grateful there is no chimney, just a hole in the roof and a fire in the middle of the room. So every morning you wake up with smoke-stained lungs, red eyes, and the faint but persistent smell of wet animal everywhere. There are no windows, with glass, just wooden shutters that keep out the cold, but also the light. So your home is perpetually dim, perpetually smoky, and perpetually crowded. Your entire family sleeps together on straw mattresses or simple wooden frames, sometimes all in the same bed, not for comfort, but because body heat is survival. And the lice, they're already awake. They've been up for hours. You rise before dawn because the fields don't wait, and neither does the Lord who technically owns everything, including your labor, your produce, and in some arrangements your entire future welcome to serfdom, the defining social contract of medieval Europe, where you work the land you don't own for a master. You didn't choose under terms. You couldn't negotiate, and in exchange you receive the generous gift of not being immediately dead. This is called feudalism, and it was presented to the average peasant, not as an economic arrangement, but as divine order. God made kings to rule, nobles to fight, and peasants to suffer quietly in the mud. Any question about the fairness of this system could be directed to the priest, who would tell you, suffering builds character, and also please bring more grain. Your back already hurts and the sun isn't even fully up. So you've peeled yourself off your smoke-scented straw pile time to eat breakfast. In medieval Europe, a meal so humble it makes ancient Greek barley bread look like fine dining. Your morning meal is pottage, a thick gray stew made from whatever didn't die last week. Grains, dried peas, beans, maybe a turnip if the season was kind, maybe a wilted cabbage leaf if it wasn't. You've been eating this same stew for 3 days because the pot never fully empties. It just gets refilled and reheated. In a cycle historians have cheerfully named the perpetual pottage situation. Bread also appears, but it's dark, dense, and rough, made from rye or barley. Not the soft wheat bread reserved for people who matter, meaning nobles and clergy. You might dip it in the pottage to soften it, or chew it slowly and think about what you did in a past life to deserve this. There is no butter unless you own a cow. And if you own a cow, congratulations, you are middle class. By medieval standards, milk is seasonal ale, is constant. because, like the ancient Greeks before them, medieval peasants drank ale. Not for pleasure, but for survival, water sources were contaminated. Cesspits, rivers, wells, all shared, all suspect. So everyone, from toddlers to grandparents, drank a weak ale called small beer all day long. You are technically mildly buzzed from sunrise to sundown, and yet none of it is fun. If you are a woman, you've been awake longer than everyone else already. You have started the fire ground, the grain fed the animals, nursed a child, and begun the pottage before. Your husband has opened one eye, medieval. Women were the invisible engine of the household, responsible for food, fiber, and family. Survival with precisely zero recognition. You spun wool, wove cloth, preserved food, tended the kitchen garden, and managed the household economy. All of this simultaneously, and all of it unpaid. You could not own property independently. You could not appear in court without a male representative. And your legal existence was largely filtered through your relationship to men, father, husband, son. If your husband died, you might be allowed to manage the family business as a widow, but only temporarily, and only as long as you remained respectable, meaning invisible and silent. In the great halls of castles, things looked different, but not necessarily better. Noble women were better fed, better dressed, and occasionally educated, but their purpose remained narrow. Marry well, produce heirs, support your husband's political ambitions, and look appropriately decorative while doing it. Marriage was a contract between families, not a union between hearts. You might be pledged to a man you'd never met at age 12 and married by 14 to someone twice your age, because love is for troubadours, and troubadours are not making political alliances. The noble lady supervised the household, managed servants, organized feasts, and handled estate affairs when her husband was away, which was often because he was out being chivalrous somewhere else. In theory, romance existed. In practice, it was a luxury. Now let's talk about getting dressed, because your wardrobe is simultaneously simpler and more complicated than you'd expect if you're a peasant. You own roughly 2 outfits, a linen undershirt worn against the skin, and a woolen tunic worn over it, both in shades of brown or gray, because dyes are expensive, and you are not that important. Shoes, if you have them, are leather simple and not particularly waterproof, because everything in medieval Europe is just slightly wet all the time. You do not own underwear in the modern sense. You own a linen shift that does multiple jobs at once: sleeping undergarment, field, garment, and the thing you die in if the fever comes fast enough. If you are a noble, the layering begins: the linen undergarment, the wool tunic, the surcoat, the belt, the hood, the hat. And if you're going anywhere important, possibly something fur-lined, because nothing signals that God loves you more than the pelts of smaller animals draped over your shoulders. Sumptuary laws existed specifically to tell you what you were allowed to wear, based on your class. Only royalty could wear. Purple ermine fur was for nobility. Certain colors were restricted. Merchants tried to dress above their station and were fined for it. Your clothing announced your rank at a glance, and stepping outside those visual boundaries was not just rude, it was legally questionable. Hygiene in medieval Europe occupies a fascinating middle ground between not as bad as you've heard and significantly worse than you'd prefer. The myth that medieval people never bathed is an exaggeration, but the reality is still far from refreshing. Public bathhouses existed in most medieval towns, and where popular hot water was considered health-giving. Many people bathed weekly, or at least regularly, by the standards of people for whom hauling water over a fire was a significant physical undertaking. The problem was not frequency entirely, it was infrastructure. There were no sewage systems in the modern sense. Waste disposal involved cesspits, which were pits in the ground that filled up, chamber pots emptied into streets from upper windows, and rivers that served simultaneously as water source, laundry facility, and open sewer. The smell of a medieval town has been described by historians, using words like vivid and character building. The streets were a navigational obstacle course of animal dung, human waste, rotting vegetable matter, and the occasional dead thing awaiting someone else's removal. Teeth were cleaned with linen cloths, or chewing on certain herbs. Some people used mixtures of chalk and salt. Deodorant did not exist, but herbs and flowers were pressed into service. Your shoes were wet, your hem was muddy, and something in the alley near the baker definitely smelled like it had been fermenting for weeks. You adapted, or you moved somewhere that smelled slightly different but probably didn't. Let us now discuss medicine, because falling ill in medieval Europe was less a medical event and more a negotiation between God the devil, your local herbs, and someone's extremely confident but completely wrong opinion. The average medieval physician combined ancient Greek humorism, herbal remedies, astrological charts, and sincere prayer into a treatment plan that would have made a modern doctor weep openly if you had a fever. You might be bled, because excess blood was clearly the problem if you had a cough. Perhaps the stars were misaligned if you had a mysterious ailment. A pilgrimage to a saint's relic might help. And if it didn't, you had at least shown sufficient devotion, which would be noted favorably at the gates of heaven. The four humors, blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, still governed medical thinking. Well into the medieval period, physicians checked. Urine examined the color, and smell sometimes tasted it, and prescribed treatments based on which humor was deemed excessive. Surgery existed and was occasionally performed by barber surgeons, men who also cut your hair and pulled your teeth, because nothing inspires surgical confidence like a man who's just finished your haircut picking up a blade bone setting, was practiced, and sometimes successful wounds were treated with honey and herbs, some of which genuinely worked through mechanisms no one understood. Wound treatment occasionally involved placing a hot iron directly on the injury to cauterize it, which was effective, and also an experience that would haunt you forever. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women, attended by midwives whose knowledge ranged from remarkably sophisticated to dangerously improvised. Infant mortality was staggering. 1 in 3 children did not survive to adulthood. Disease swept through communities with terrifying speed because the germ theory of disease would not arrive for several more centuries, and miasma, bad air, was blamed for illness, meaning that the cure for epidemic disease was often to burn fragrant herbs near your face, which was not the cure. And then came the plague. The Black Death arrived in Europe around 1347, carried by fleas on rats traveling along trade routes, and within 5 years it had killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire European population, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. People died within days of showing symptoms. Buboes swelled in the armpits and groin skin, blackened with subcutaneous bleeding fever. Delirium, and then death came with horrifying speed. Entire villages were emptied. Families vanished in a week. Priests refused last rites out of terror. Grave diggers died before the graves were filled. Bodies were stacked in carts and dumped in mass graves. Without ceremony, people fled cities, carrying the disease with them into the countryside. They burned the belongings of the dead. They flagellated themselves in public processions. Believing sin was the cause, they blamed Jewish people and slaughtered them in pogroms. Of catastrophic violence, they prayed, they wept. they ran and still it came. Medieval Europe had no framework to understand what was happening. No explanation that fit, no treatment. That helped it was simply death, arriving without invitation. At scale never seen before, and the psychological scar it left on European civilization took generations to close. If you were a man of fighting age in medieval Europe, military service was a regular feature of your existence. Not a career choice, but a fact of life, the feudal system required military service from nobles in exchange for land, who in turn required it from knights who in exchange for protection required it from the peasants below them, who mostly showed up with farm tools. And terror warfare in the medieval period was a combination of cavalry charges, siege warfare arrows, diseases contracted during long campaigns, and blunt trauma administered enthusiastically by the opposing side knights trained for years, learning horsemanship, lancework, sword fighting, and the art of falling off a horse in full armor without dying. Immediately, armor itself was a marvel of medieval engineering, interlocking plates of steel carefully fitted to the wearer, capable of deflecting arrows and sword blows, but also weighing between 15 and 25 kilograms, which is the kind of weight that makes a summer campaign feel like a test of spiritual endurance. If you were infantry, you had less armor, more exposure, and a position closer to the part of the battle where bad things happen most frequently. Siege warfare was particularly brutal. Armies surrounded castles for months, digging tunnels, undermining walls, building siege engines, launching not just rocks, but the bodies of dead animals over walls to spread disease, waiting the enemy out through starvation disease, and the slow erosion of morale. Soldiers died not just in combat, but from dysentery, infected wounds, exposure, and the psychological accumulation of campaigns that never seemed to end. There was no veterans care, no pension, no therapy. A surviving soldier came home with scars, a potentially broken body, and a sword that needed sharpening for the next time. The church was not separate from medieval life. It was medieval life from birth to death, baptism, marriage, confession. Last rites, the church marked every significant moment of human existence. The parish church was the center of the village. The priest was administrator, record keeper, and moral authority. The church calendar governed when you worked, when you rested, what you ate, and how you thought about time itself. There were over 100 feast days annually on which labor was forbidden, which sounds generous until you realize that not working also meant not eating. And the church still expected its tithe, which was 10% of everything you produced, whether or not the harvest had been good, whether or not you could spare it. The great cathedrals rising above medieval cities were the most ambitious building projects of the era, taking generations to complete, employing thousands of workers, most of whom would never see the finished result. They were built as acts of collective devotion, physical monuments to the glory of God, and they were genuinely magnificent. The theology behind them was sophisticated, and sincere medieval scholars debated philosophy, theology, and the nature of existence with rigorous intensity. Universities emerged in the medieval period: Bologna, Oxford, Paris, Bologna, in the early 1100s, producing generations of clergymen, lawyers, and physicians who would eventually reshape European thought. But access to all of this was ruthlessly restricted. Women were excluded from universities entirely. Peasants had neither the time nor the money. Heresy was a crime punishable by death, and the definition of heresy depended somewhat on who was currently in charge. The Inquisition investigated, examined, and sometimes tortured Those accused of diverging from official doctrine, the intention, according to its own reasoning, was to save souls by any means necessary. The reality was coercive, violent, and politically useful for those who wielded it. If the knights were the military class, the merchants were the rising disruptors of the medieval order trade. In medieval Europe was expanding rapidly by the High Middle Ages. Market towns flourished, trade fairs attracted merchants from across the continent. The Hanseatic League, a network of trading cities across northern Europe, moved goods from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. A merchant family with sufficient ambition and luck could accumulate wealth that rivaled minor nobility, which made the nobility deeply uncomfortable. The cities that grew around trade were not comfortable places. Narrow streets, crowded tenements, workshops, and markets crammed together with no planning and minimal sanitation. But they were alive with energy. Noise, commerce, and possibility guilds regulated every trade from bakers to blacksmiths, setting standards, protecting members, controlling apprenticeships, and keeping newcomers out. If you wanted to become a master craftsman, you served years as an apprentice, then as a journeyman. Then you produced a masterwork, literally a piece demonstrating mastery, and only then might you be admitted to the guild. It was slow, rigid, and deeply resistant to innovation, but it produced goods of remarkable quality and gave skilled workers a degree of collective protection in an otherwise precarious world. Entertainment in medieval Europe was loud, communal, and frequently dangerous. Feast days brought music dancing and theatrical performances. Mystery plays performed on wagon stages moved through town depicting biblical stories with elaborate costumes and enthusiastic acting jousting tournaments. Drew crowds from miles around. These were not merely sport. They were theater with genuine risk. A land strike at full gallop from a mounted knight could and occasionally did kill people, which added a certain authenticity to the spectacle taverns, were the social hub of every town, serving ale, food, gossip, and occasionally violence. Dice games were popular, illegal, and played constantly. Gambling debts were the kind of thing that started fights and ended friendships. Storytellers moved from town to town, carrying news, entertainment, and wildly embellished accounts of distant events. The troubadours of southern France and minstrels across northern Europe carried poetry, music, and courtly love traditions from castle to castle, turning the ideals of chivalry into song that bore very little relationship to the actual daily behavior of knights, but sounded magnificent, delivered in a candlelit hall to people who had spent the day in armor. And then on the margins of medieval society lived those the system had no comfortable place for Jewish communities, existed across medieval Europe, contributing to commerce, medicine, and scholarship, while facing waves of persecution, exclusion, forced conversion, massacre, and expulsion. England expelled its Jewish population in 1290. France did the same in 1306. The pattern repeated across the continent, driven by religious hostility, economic jealousy, and the convenient availability of a community to blame when things went wrong. Lepers were isolated in leprosaria outside town limits, required to carry bells or clappers to announce their approach, barred from markets, churches, and ordinary social life. The treatment of illness as moral failure made the sick doubly punished, first by the disease, then by the social exclusion that followed those who wandered between communities. The rootless, the landless, the refugees of warfare and famine were regarded with suspicion, moved along harassed, taxed, and occasionally simply absorbed into the labor needs of whoever needed work done. The medieval world was one of intense communal solidarity within its boundaries and startling cruelty toward those outside them. So after everything, the smoky one-room homes, the gray pottage, the mud, The plague, the bleeding cures, the feudal obligations, the church tithes, the bells at 3 in the morning, the animals sleeping 3 feet from your head. Let's ask the honest question. Plainly, would you last a single day in medieval Europe? No, you would not. You would fold somewhere between the first bowl of pottage and the discovery that there is no door between you and the pig. You are accustomed to antibiotics and insulated walls, and the option of a hot shower and a reliable food supply. You would miss your phone, your coffee, your right to make choices about your own labor, and your ability to travel more than 3 miles from where you were born without it being notable. You might love the idea of it, the candlelight, the tapestries, the drama of it all. But for the overwhelming majority of people, medieval life was repetitive, exhausting, contingent, and brief. Your medicine was guesswork. Your housing was smoke. Your diet was one failed harvest away from crisis. Your social mobility was largely a matter of which family you had had the foresight to be born into. And your life expectancy was approximately 35 years. If you avoided the plague, the childbirth complications, the infected wounds, and the occasional war. And yet for all of that, medieval Europe endured and built it, built cathedrals that still stand universities, that still teach legal systems, that still underpin modern democracies, agricultural innovations, that slowly transformed productivity, philosophical and theological traditions, that shaped how Western civilization thinks about knowledge, ethics, and the nature of existence. The people who lived these lives weren't suffering in silence. They were singing, building, arguing, praying, falling in love, telling stories, and making sense of a world that was often trying to kill them. They found meaning inside the harshness they built, community inside the constraint, and they handed something forward to every century that followed. Not because life was easy, but because human beings are extraordinarily persistent at finding reasons to continue, even in the mud, even in the smoke, even with the pig. So no, you probably wouldn't make it past your first morning, your first bowl of cold pottage, your first discovery of what medieval sanitation actually involved. But if you did, if you adapted, endured, and listened closely, you would find yourself surrounded by some of the most resilient, creative, and stubbornly alive people history has ever produced, and they wouldn't pity you for struggling. They would hand you a wooden spoon point at the pot and say, "Good, now stir it. The bells ring in an hour, and the fields won't wait."